the United States is doing everything it can to try to derail the Chinese economy. It claims, of course, it isn't, but it is. And as you mentioned, we've been through this before. Of course, the whole Cold War non-military side of the U.S. vis-a-vis the Soviet Union was about economic and technological containment. That was the core organizing idea. And that playbook was used, ironically, against America's ally, Japan, in the 1980s. And it's a period I remember well because I started as an assistant professor in economics at Harvard in 1980. And I went on my first visit to Japan in 1981. And I went with a wonderful colleague, Ezra Vogel, who had written a book which was the Japanese bestseller of the time called Japan as Number One. And Japan as Number One was about the surge of Japanese manufacturing, Sony and Toyota and so forth. And it said Japan has developed a lot of remarkable process improvements, just-in-time manufacturing and so forth. And it was now a dominant manufacturing power. And of course, it was not only in consumer electronics, but increasingly in semiconductors and other cutting-edge technologies. And this was a celebratory mood of Japan in the 1980s. And one could watch, and I watched it close up, how American policymakers, wait a minute, this is an ally that's supposed to be subservient to us. Now it's taking our industry. And by the second half of the 1980s, all this American rhetoric and supposed ideology of the liberal order and so forth, of course, was turned on its head. We need to stop Japan. We need to stop Japan's economy, but we can't do it in just those terms. Japan's a bulwark of our power in East Asia. So we have to do it by agreement. And in the late 1980s, the agreement was Japan would stop exporting to the United States, even though it was hyper-competitive vis-a-vis the United States. And the Plaza Agreement that you recall rightly was an agreement that Japan would massively overvalue its currency. Kind of a remarkable idea, but the Japanese yen soared in value, but by design. This was a policy of the United States. The US also imposed many export limits on Japan, and these were called voluntary because Japan, as being a part of the US security system, accepted them and said, we won't export to the United States automobiles or semiconductors and so forth. And by the end of the 1980s, Japanese growth had stopped. But it had stopped absolutely because the United States had stopped it. And Japan, in its way, had acceded to that in public. So the public rhetoric was, well, Japan's entering a recession. The behind the scenes, of course, was the United States had engineered the stop of Japan's relentless manufacturing success. And Japan went into a financial crisis because finance is based on extrapolation. So asset prices are based on extrapolating the rapid growth into the future. And when Japan's rapid growth into the future was no longer rapid, then asset prices collapsed. And in 1990, 1991, 1992, we had the so-called bursting of the Japanese bubble. And Japan went into a long and prolonged crisis. And the US policymakers said, well, Japan's aggregate demand is down, meaning it wasn't selling exports anymore. That was the US policy. Japan should increase its consumption and stop bothering us, basically, with the exports. And I had a very interesting and distinct conversation with one of Japan's top economic policymakers in the mid-1990s, who was a friend and very senior, let's just say. And I said, why don't you weaken the currency? You know, your exports have completely stalled. You have a lack of growth. Japan's no longer competitive. And he looked at me and he said, Jeff, the U.S. won't let us do it. Okay, this is clear. It's kind of obvious, but never said. What is said in the history books is Japan had a balance sheet recession. Japan had, a bursting of a bubble. But Japan faced geopolitics straight away. And because Japan was under the U.S. thumb, it never publicly complained.